Hello everyone, we're starting a new series today called The Lack of Davening on Shabbos. What do I mean? After all, davening during the week at most takes an hour for Shachris, but on Shabbos it takes 2 hours and more. So what do I mean lack of davening? The answer is the actual definition of the word davening in art literature. It does not mean praise, it does not mean thanksgiving. Indeed, the Gemara says in Masechet Brachot Daf Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, La'olam yisader adam shvachol shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'achar kach yitpalel. First praise God and then daven. So what is davening? Let's take the codification of the Rambam when he codifies what he believes is a biblical commandment once a day every day, and that is to daven. 3 times a day is rabbinic, but once a day every day is biblical. Says the Rambam, Chiyuv mitzvah zo kachu. This is the way you fulfill this once a day biblical commandment. Magid shvachol shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. First, praise God. Next, achar kach, shoel tzrachav shu tzarich lahem bebakasha uvetchina. You petition God and request of God everything you need with a proper request and obviously supplication in a respectful way. V'achar kach noten shevach v'odaya l'Hashem. And afterwards, you thank God. So ultimately, davening should consist of 3 things: praise, request, and thanksgiving. From this perspective, the Midrash Tanchuma says explicitly, Atamotze Yudchet, in the Amida, which is the climax of davening, Shemitpalalim b'chol yom, that we daven every day. Ve'einan kulan nishvachol shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not only a story of praise of God, Ela shalosh rishonot v'shalosh achronot. The first 3, the last 3, are indeed praise of God. V'shtemesrei brachot. Today, not shtemesrei 12, but rather 13. Kulan litzarcho shel adam. Everything is indeed the needs of a human being. From this perspective, we all know that on Shabbos there isn't not 18, not even 19. There is only 7. 3 at the beginning, which is praise. 3 at the end, which is thanksgiving. But the middle one is just one bracha, and it talks about Shabbos, but it does not have in it, at least from the outsider's first blush look, any request. Indeed, the question is, why? Why don't we request on Shabbos? And it's based on a Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit. The Gemara there does not say you don't request on Shabbos, but like many times in our Talmud, comes through the back door and says in the middle of a conversation that al elu, on these, matri'in b'Shabbat, that you can indeed request on Shabbos. And it talks about various things that are pikuach nefesh, that are life endangering, like Irshi Kifur Gayas, a city that's encircled by enemies. Val Sfina Miturefet Bayam, or there's a ship at sea and it's in distress. And indeed, there's a dissenting opinion, and that is Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, indeed, on Shabbos, you can call the ambulance, what's called le'ezra. You can call the security forces. Aval lo letzaka. You cannot request of God in davening to help you on Shabbos. Why not? Simply because, says Rashi, how do you know God's listening? Maybe God doesn't listen. So when you call the ambulance, you know it's going to come. When you call the police, you know they're going to come. But when you daven, you don't know that God indeed is going to listen. So therefore, there's no heter, quote unquote, to daven to God on Shabbos. So thankfully, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yossi. As the Perush HaMishnah, the Rambam says on that Mishnah, Be'ein halacha Rabbi Yossi, Sara Sa'aka Aleihem b'Shabbat. Ella, rather, Zoakinu mitanin alehem bilotkia. You don't blow the shofar, but indeed you can daven and request of God when there's an actual pikuach nefesh. So as we say in Rabbinic Hebrew, Michlal hein ata shomei lav, namely, when indeed the Gemara says these are what you're allowed to do on Shabbos, we understand what you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, and that is that you are not allowed to request of God on Shabbos, but rather only in a case of pikuach nefesh, in a case of actual life endangerment. And this is what the Rambam codifies in his Code of Jewish Law, B'Shabbatot, Lo zoakim u'mitchanenim bahem b'tfilah. You do not request of God in davening, Elaim kain, except Haya'ir Shiki Goyim, if the city is encircled by a foreign army or other pikuach nefesh situations. In such a situation, then of course, mitchanenim alehem b'tfilah, you can indeed daven to God. And this is the way the Torah in his Code of Jewish Law, Rav Yaakov Balaturim, indeed Paskins, like the Rambam, that if indeed there's a pikuach nefesh, you can go and daven. So even though Rashi said, maybe God's not listening, and that was the dissenting opinion of Rabbi Yossi, we Paskin like the majority view, and that is that we can, in a case of Pikuach Nefesh, request of God on Shabbos. However, if it's not Pikuach Nefesh, then on the surface, you're not allowed to go ahead and request from God on Shabbos. This is the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins in two different places, both in Hilchos Shabbos, where he says this explicitly, as you can see on the screen, and in Hilchos Ta'aniyot, where he talks about fast days, and which days you're allowed to fast, not allowed to fast. He repeats this, that indeed, on a situation of Pikuach Nefesh, that Sakanat Hayom, namely, there is an endangerment on that day to the Jewish people or to you, Zoakim u'mitchanenim b'tfilot Shabbat, you're allowed to go ahead and daven. But on a regular Shabbos, we don't, quote-unquote, daven. We don't request of God. And that will explain why is it that in our Amidah, we took out the 13 blessings of petition and replaced them with a different blessing. Because on a regular Shabbos, where there is no life-endangering situation, you're not allowed to request of God. Quoting the words of the Midrash Tanchuma that I already quoted, Lefigach, ein mitpalalim b'Shabbat Shmona Esrei. And therefore David HaMelech said, Sheva bayom hilalaticha, he says in Tehillim, I praised you in 7 ways. What does he mean? Elu zayin brachot shemit palalim b'Shabbat. These are the 7 blessings that we say on Shabbos. So, it's no surprise that the Meiri says, V'lo nitana Shabbat le'tfilah, Shabbos is not for davening. Shel she'ilat tzorech, of requesting. Ela litfilah, but rather a prayer service of shevach v'hoda'ah, praise and thanksgiving, v'kiddush yom HaShabbat v'zechirato, and sanctifying the day and remembering it. The Ravid says exactly the same thing. Aval tfilat Shabbat she'ino ela hoda'ot. The davening of Shabbos is only thanksgiving. So there is a lack of davening on Shabbos, while every day there's request, and that is, according to the Rambam, the basic way to fulfill our obligation, namely you must have praise, request, and thanksgiving. It seems like we don't have it on Shabbos. The question is, why? And God willing, in the next podcast, we'll deal with why is it that indeed it is inappropriate to request of God on Shabbos unless there's a Pikuach Nefesh situation at hand.